Hi class, this is Susan Priest, and I'm starting my series on Christianity, and I've divided this lecture series up into two parts. One will be about research about the historical Jesus compared to the Christ of faith, and then the second part is going to be more of the basic beliefs and practices of modern day Christianity and the divisions. So first off, it's of course always, I think, challenging in some ways to uh, teach a basic overview of Christianity. Um, I don't want to assume anything about my listeners out there, but I know you all have different levels of experience and background and maybe feelings about Christianity, maybe positive, maybe negative, maybe neutral. So just keep in mind, um, just as best as possible, just try and take everything I say with a grain of salt and just go, okay, well, let me think about that a little bit more. Try not to jump to conclusion. I've had a lot of years to study this, and I may be introducing you to some new ideas, believe it or not, and some of the ideas may be in conflict with what you've heard before. So dig a little deeper. So one of the questions, and Huston Smith starts out his whole chapter kind of talking about the difference between the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith. And I kind of like to do the same thing with all of you. So this was an image from a BBC documentary done a few years back. Maybe it was 2005. It might have been before that. Where they were trying to sort of recreate what a first century Palestinian man might have looked like, or Israelite man might have looked like. So here is, now the claim is not to say this is Jesus, but the claim is, you know what, this is probably what he looked like. So what we have been inundated with, whether we are aware of it or not, is a whole history and tradition of European artists who have depicted Jesus of Nazareth as a light-skinned, or even white, blue-eyed man. And this just doesn't make sense. So it may sound really basic, but just keep in mind that some of our perceptions of who Jesus was have been inordinately determined by art history, more so than you think, more so than the Bible, absolutely more so than the Bible, and more so than reason. So a couple of things that we could ask ourselves is, what can we really know about the historical Jesus, the person who lived 2,000 years ago? Well, one thing that we can know for sure is that he was Jewish. Jesus was born to a Jewish family, and when he died, he was Jewish. In his lifetime, he never said, I am no longer Jewish, now I am Christian. Now, this may sound really basic, but it's very important. He's not even like Buddha, who obviously was creating a new religion during his lifetime. We don't have evidence that Jesus was trying to create a new religion. We have evidence that he was Jewish, and he was perhaps talking about a renewal movement within Judaism, but not that he was actually trying to create a new religion. So keep that in mind. We do know for sure there's ample evidence to suggest that at the time that Jesus lived was a time of great political and social unrest in Jerusalem. Now, let me just say something, because I neglected to say something about the dates that I included there. So the dating of Jesus needed to have been born by no later than 4 BCE, because according to the biblical record, he was born when Herod the Great was still ruling in Jerusalem. So that would mean he would have to have been born no later than 4 BCE, because that was the year that King Herod died. So again, tying back to our Judaism lecture, we can see that there were 4 groups of Jews who were kind of in conflict with each other in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus's life. So there were the Sadducees, who ruled the temple. There were the Pharisees, who were the rabbis who were teachers but didn't have the same status as the Sadducees. There were the Essenes, who were kind of like an ascetic commune out in the desert. And there were the Zealots, who didn't think that there should be any person other than a Jewish person ruling in Jerusalem. So they were organized against the Roman rule. A couple things. Some scholars would suggest that the historical Jesus probably came from a family of Pharisees. John the Baptist was believed to have been an Essene, and perhaps Judas was a Zealot. So one thing that historical scholars say about when they look at the body of teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, they would say that he was very similar to a Greek cynical philosopher by the name of Diogenes, Diogenes. And Diogenes lived after the time of Plato, but he was, his main focus in ancient Greece was protesting against social injustice, especially the social inequality of the classes. Now, from time to time, I do have students who tell me, oh, Jesus wasn't really a human. We just don't have very much evidence. That's not plausible to me. It's certainly not in the same way that we say that Lao Tzu is questionable. But there are authors who write about Jesus outside of the Bible, namely Josephus, who is a Jewish historian, Pliny the Younger, who was a Roman governor, and Tacitus. So we can say, it's not huge, but there's evidence outside the Bible which suggests that Jesus was not a made-up character. Now, some of you may be thinking, why should we care about the historical Jesus? You'll notice that there's quite a few videos uploaded to the module that came from a pretty good series done by ABC a few years ago about the life of the historical Jesus. True confession, I am, full disclosure, one of my teachers in seminary was a part of the Historical Jesus Scholarship in the 1980s. And so I'm a little bit influenced by one of my professors. So that's one of the reasons why I like to bring it up. I'll tell you why. There's some other reasons. But you might be wondering, well, why should we care what we can say about the historical Jesus? Well, maybe there's a concern for accuracy, right? Is there any difference between what we can know about the historical Jesus and what we think that Jesus said? So we have people, notice Samuel Reimarus was a German scholar who his work on the historical Jesus was not published until after his death. Probably because at the time that he was living, he would have lost his job. He said that Jesus was a Jewish revolutionary that failed to overthrow the Roman government. David Friedrich Strauss, in the 1800s, published a book in 1835 looking at the historical Jesus, and he actually lost his teaching position after it was published. Then we see a little bit later on in the 19th century, H.J. Holtzman did some biblical scholarship to suggest that the first gospel written was the Gospel of Mark. And that view is supported by modern scholarship, and it's held to this day. So I'll talk more about the ordering of the books of the Bible in a moment. So probably the most famous author was Albert Schweitzer, who was a very famous Christian missionary and doctor who published a book in 1906 called The Search for the Historical Jesus. And he was trying to find out what were the original oral teachings of Jesus. And Albert Schweitzer, his scholarship determined that Jesus was a misguided apocalyptist. So what does that mean? One view that was quite popular at the time of Jesus among interpretations of Judaism was the idea that the end of the world was coming soon. And the end of the world is actually talked about in Hebrew scriptures. And the end of the world in Hebrew scriptures is always associated with a final bodily resurrection. So resurrecting the good from their graves and restoring the world. So, but Albert Schweitzer determined that Jesus was misguided because the end of the world did not happen. Has it happened yet? Has the world ended? Well, not in a conventional sense, right? So Albert Schweitzer determined that the historical Jesus was irrelevant to modern people. He didn't say Jesus was irrelevant. He didn't say that Jesus Christ or the Christ of faith was irrelevant, but he determined that the historical Jesus was irrelevant. Now, let's go to what happens after World War II. I'm going to say a few words about why I think, so think about what happened in World War II. Think about Nazi Germany and Nazi Germany killing at least 6 million Jews, in addition to gypsies and gay people and a whole host of other people that they deemed to be riffraff. And ask yourself the question, how could all of those German Christians, how come they were okay with killing Jewish people when Jesus was Jewish? So there seems to have been a kind of like amnesia about who Jesus really was, in my mind. And maybe, hindsight is 20/20, but really, if we don't have a sense of who the historical Jesus is, perhaps we will run into the error of thinking that Jesus was. So one of the things claimed in Nazi Germany and has been wrongly claimed by some Christians today is the idea that the Jews killed Jesus. That's just flat out wrong. The Romans killed Jesus. The Jews didn't have power over Rome. They did not have power over Rome. So maybe some of the early Christian followers of Jesus were mad at some of the Jews who didn't want to follow Jesus. Right? I think that makes more sense. But Jesus was Jewish. So we have to look at the reality of what happens after World War II and really look at why actually looking for the historical Jesus might be important. And then there was a couple of other major discoveries. There was the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which began in 1947. And there was another set of discoveries that was even more important to early Christianity called the discovery at the Nag Hammadi in Egypt. And this happened in 1945. And there were a whole series of discoveries about ancient texts which would actually make us think a little bit differently, both about ancient Judaism and about the origins of Christianity. So in the 1950s, one scholar, Caseman, said, it's actually pretty important not to separate the Christ of faith from Jesus of history. So now we get to more recent history. About 1985, there were a group of international scholars who were represented from different faith traditions, both Jewish and Protestant Christians and Roman Catholic Christians, and even people who had no religious affiliation at all, but who were New Testament scholars, who joined together to create something called the Jesus Seminar. So famous among these are John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg. And in the video clips that you'll see in the module, both of these two are interviewed. Marcus Borg was my professor in seminary. So interestingly, this is what happened in the 1980s, is all of these scholars got together and they went through all of the words that are ascribed to being in the voice of Jesus from the New Testament. So think about the four Gospels. If anyone's familiar with going to church and maybe seeing a Bible in the pews in church, most of those pew Bibles have the words of Jesus in red. So when the Jesus Seminar gathered, they actually voted secretly on every single quote that's attributed to the historical Jesus, and they voted in secret so they wouldn't influence each other. So every time a passage came up, people would present the evidence, and then they would pass around a bag and put in 3 different colored marbles. If they thought it was really the voice of the historical Jesus, they would put red. If they were not sure, they would put a gray marble. And if they were pretty convinced that what was attributed to the historical Jesus was probably not the historical Jesus, but the early church saying that that's what Jesus said. So they had this. So this was very controversial when this happened. So what was the conclusion of the Jesus Seminar? The conclusion of the Jesus Seminar is that the true voice of Jesus is represented primarily by the weird sayings and parables that are in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The lengthy meditations from the Gospel of John are not believed to have been the historical Jesus. Now, part of the reason why is that it's clear that the New Testament, the Gospels of the New Testament, were not written down until 20, 30, 40 years after Jesus died. So the assertion is that whatever is actually in the true voice of Jesus would have to be something that could be easily memorized. And it doesn't make sense that Jesus was talking in this really flowery Greek, which is what is in the Gospel of John. So the Gospel of John has a much different type of Greek in form and style than Matthew, Mark, or Luke. So if you can imagine, one of the things that came out of the Jesus Seminar was that all of the Gospel of John is not the historical Jesus. So can you think of any scripture from the Gospel of John that might really tick people off, that the Jesus seminar was saying was not really the words of Jesus? I'll give you a hint. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever should believeth in him would not die, but would have eternal life. So that was one thing. Probably the most controversial was saying that the scholars did not think the Gospel of John was the true historical Jesus. The other assertions from the Jesus Seminar was that Jesus was not apocalyptic, but was in fact a wisdom sage, that Jesus was concerned with social justice, and he was concerned with people's personal relationship with God, and also that he was a healer, a spiritual healer. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the Nag Hammadi discovery, because most people have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls being discovered, but actually the discovery at Nag Hammadi is way more important to early Christianity. So in 1945, there was this, I think he was just a sheep herder or something. Muhammad Ali he found these urns that contained 13 leather-bound manuscripts, and they were found in Egypt. There were 13 books that were preserved. We know that Muhammad Ali brought those home, and he didn't know what they were, and his mother might have thrown some of them into the fire for kindling to bake bread. So maybe there were more than 13 books. The books were written in Coptic, which is sort of Greek letters that are used to communicate a certain language, Egyptian language of Coptic. They're now in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. So one of the things that was found is it was the Gospel of Thomas. And the Gospel of Thomas is not in the New Testament. And it has many parallels to the Synoptic Gospels, which would include Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But it seems to be much different than, it's basically a book of sayings. So let me give you an example. This is a chapter 74, 76, and 77 of the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus said, "Lord, there are many around the drinking trough, but there is nothing in the well." Jesus said, "There are many standing at the door, but those who are alone will enter the bridal suite." Jesus said, "The Father's imperial rule is like a merchant who had a supply of merchandise and then found a pearl. The merchant was prudent. He sold the merchandise and bought the single pearl for himself. So also with you, seek his treasure that is unfailing, that is enduring, where no moth comes to eat and no worm destroys." I'm going to go on a little bit more. Chapter 77, Jesus said, "I am the light that is over all things. I am all. From me all came forth, and to me all attained. Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there." So they're just a series of sayings. And it seems like there was probably some disagreement in the early church about whether the Gospel of Thomas should be in the Bible or the Gospel of John. But Gospel of John won the argument, historical argument for sure. So there are some other weird texts in the Nag Hammadi that might just really shock you, like the infancy gospel of Thomas. Um, so maybe on a Zoom conference, I'll read one of those to you because I think it might be just too controversial to put it in this lecture. So then, of course, we have to ask ourselves, so there's all these weird ideas that floated around about the historical Jesus, or maybe not weird, just that may seem to be different than the Christ of faith. So here's a very famous statue of Jesus in Brazil with the outstretched arms, the Sacred Heart of Jesus. You can see a very light-skinned man. Here is an angel of God from Greek iconography. Here's another image from Greek iconography. And here's a painting by Paul Gauguin. And notice how he is depicted in yellow, right? And he's kind of like in the Flemish countryside. And the people who are around the cross are not seen as ancient Palestinians, right? But probably Flemish peasant women from the late 19th century. So one of the things that we know is that different images of Jesus really are different in different cultures. So images of Jesus in Japan makes Jesus look Japanese. Here he looks more Greek, maybe more European. So the idea is that really we don't know what Jesus really looked like. But what we do know is there are some unifying ideas from a belief standpoint about why the Christ of faith was important. This is a really famous painting by Salvador Dali of Jesus looking over the world. So, of course, one of the assertions by people of faith is that Jesus was born of a virgin. Now, notice the story of Jesus' virgin birth is only in the Gospel of Luke. The idea is we don't know a lot about Jesus' childhood, but even as a youth, he was spirit-filled. All the Gospels, at least the first 3 Gospels, agree that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, who we believe was an Essene. And this act is the beginning of Jesus' ministry. So after he gets baptized, he goes out and fasts and prays for 40 days and nights. Sound familiar? He fasted and prayed, and he was tempted by the devil. So certainly there's historical scholars don't doubt that this actually happened, but they might say, well, if somebody is fasting and not eating for 40 days and nights, they probably would have some wild hallucinations. But as the story goes, Jesus is tempted and isn't swayed by temptation. And it's after this experience that he starts his ministry, which lasts about 3 years. So all scholars agree that he taught for about 3 years, and his ministry included kind of wandering around the countryside, teaching with parables, and healing people who had some kind of affliction. The other part of the message of the Christ of faith is that Jesus was crucified and on the 3rd day was resurrected. So this is the faith assertion. And all of the 4 Gospels that are in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all agree on that. But what's also part of the belief of Christians as far as who the Christ of faith is that he wasn't just it's not just that he died and then was bodily resurrected. He was actually around to teach in this risen bodily form afterwards for another 40 days or so. He appeared to his apostles after death, and he actually transformed new believers like Paul. Paul never met the historical Jesus, but according to tradition, he was converted by like having an experience of the risen Christ. And Paul was the most influential early Christian in starting believers and Christian communities. So the other assertion is that the followers of Jesus referred to him as Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. So the New Testament are the portion of the Bible outside of the Hebrew Scriptures, and they are written in, the original Scriptures are written in Greek. The first 4 books are Gospels, or accounts of Jesus's life. So the word gospel means good news. And this is the order in which they appear in the Bible. First Matthew, then Mark, then Luke, then John. But what I did is next to each of the Gospels, I wrote down approximately when they are believed to have been written down. So notice that Mark is deemed to be the first gospel that was written. And it was written down during a time of great crisis, because it was during the Jewish war against Rome, which ended in the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. So, as an experiment, if you want to do this, just pick up a Bible and only read the Gospel of Mark. It's really short. It's like 16 chapters. And ask yourself, what's Jesus like in this book? Because if you read the Gospels separately, you would notice that each Gospel has a distinct flavor and a distinctive way of talking about Jesus. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is seen as very Jewish, descended from the King David. In Mark, Jesus seems like he's always on the run, right? He's constantly moving around, and there's a lot of jump cuts. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus, that's where we get the stories about the Virgin Mary and Jesus reaching out to Gentiles as well as Jewish people. Remember, Gentiles are probably Jewish followers who did not get circumcised. And then John, the Gospel of John, we see a much more, a different kind of Jesus, and really the Greek is much different. And it is considered to be a later documentation. The Acts of the Apostles, which follow the Gospel of John, are early Christian history, and it's the same author as the Gospel of Luke, who's not Luke, okay? So these names, don't get hung up on these names. But actually, the earliest scriptures of the New Testament are the epistles, or the letters that Paul wrote to other Christian communities. The first epistle written was the First Thessalonians, and then Galatians. And so Paul, who was a convert to Christianity, or he was the earliest arbiter, or the earliest interpreter of what Christianity would be. And he was ultimately imprisoned by Rome and killed. But he believed that the end of the world was coming any day. Now, he died before the destruction of the temple, but this kind of changed everything. Notice that most of the scriptures, the Gospels don't get recorded until, most of them don't get recorded until after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. The final book in the New Testament, the book of Revelation, is symbolic prophecy, attributed to be around, written down somewhere like 95 CE.